Mr. Chancellor, colleagues, graduating students, parents, and guests, it's with great pleasure that I present to you the Honorable Michael Kirby. Dr. Kirby has had a distinguished career as a public servant holding a progressive series of senior positions. I think surprisingly, for many of us who think of the public service as the domain of lawyers and administrators, his choice of career followed his completion of a series of degrees in mathematics. Now, although some of you, at least the parents among the audience, might know him best for his 10-year stint as a panelist on Canada AM, the political pundits panel, Dr. Kirby is more than just a charismatic media personality. He has an extremely distinguished career as a public servant, and I could spend a long time going through his many achievements. It's no surprise, given that he launched his show of dedication to the public service over 40 years ago in Nova Scotia. But I've already been warned. I know for a fact that Dr. Kirby himself would be least pleased in having me go through the details of his long and accomplished career, as he's repeatedly complained that what we consider a distinguished career might instead suggest he can't keep a job. And so I'm going to speak to the highlights that alone I think merit his recognition today. Among his many achievements, Dr. Kirby was the Secretary to the Cabinet for the Federal-Provincial Relations and Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council. In this capacity, he was deeply involved in the negotiations that led to the patriation of the Canadian Constitution and the inclusion of the Charter of Rights in the Constitution. This was transformational to our identity as Canadians. Dr. Kirby was summoned to the Senate in 1984 and retired in 2006. I think his term on Senate is an example of when Senate works. During his term as chair of the Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology, Canada's healthcare system was a major focus of the committee's work. Its two-year study of the hospital and medical system culminated in the 2002 report Recommendations for Reform, and many of these recommendations have been and continue to be enacted by the federal government. In 2006, under Senator Kirby's leadership, the same committee completed a national study on mental health, mental illness, and addiction. The final report, called Out of the Shadows at Last, which he co-authored, was released in 2006. It has commonly come to be known as the Kirby Report, and it brought into focus the challenges encountered by people with mental illness in society and in the Canadian health system. People suffering from mental illness have been stigmatized, blamed for their illness, and too often find themselves without recourse for treatment. This includes marginalized social groups such as the poor and homeless, children with difficulties in coping with life challenges and serious traumas, Aboriginals contending with generations of discrimination, and seniors who are slowly losing control of their physical health and social environments. By identifying vulnerable populations and challenging the stigma that cloaks their distress, it's no wonder that the Kirby Report created a considerable wave of reaction and was welcomed, commended, and embraced by all of those working in the mental health field, by those experiencing mental illness, and by the friends and families whose close ones were suffering mental illness. One of the key recommendations of that report was the creation of the Mental Health Commission of Canada, to which Dr. Kirby was appointed chair in March of 2007. The commission and its initiatives under his leadership are likely to have a transformational impact on the quality of life of Canadians who suffer from addictions and mental illnesses. In 2008, the Governor-General of Canada appointed Dr. Kirby as an Officer of the Order of Canada in recognition of his lifetime of outstanding achievement. As you can see, Dr. Kirby has been a strong advocate for improving the health and mental health services in Canada, working toward making it possible for people with mental illness to be treated with respect, care, and true understanding. His actions will have an impact on Canadians for a long time to come. Mr. Chancellor, in recognition of his role in bringing about positive change to the mental health system and the quality of life of Canadians suffering from mental illness or addictions, I request that you confer the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa, upon Michael Kirby.
By virtue of my authority, I confer upon you the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa.
Thank you, Kim, for those wonderfully short remarks. Before I start, all of you in the back, all the family and friends, had the opportunity to be cheered by the students, the graduating class, who many of you have supported for a great many years, and indeed, unfortunately, may end up supporting for some time into the future. Nevertheless, I think it's important that the graduates who, after all, really are the winners here today, are really the people we're here to celebrate, hear from you. And so I would like to ask everybody, other than the graduates, everybody in the back of the hall, to stand up and give a real round of applause for your graduates. Thank you for that, and trust me, they really deserved it. Chancellor Gray, President Runty, faculty members, and distinguished guests, but most of all, graduates. I want to begin by thanking members of the Academic Senate of Carleton University for voting to award me an honorary degree, because that's how the decisions are made. I am truly honored, but I'm also delighted to be able to illustrate to you, who've certainly read lots about the senators that are in the Canadian Parliament like I was. I think it's important that you understand that, in fact, it is possible for a Canadian senator to win an election, because that's essentially what the Academic Senate at the university did. What I would like to do is do two very brief things. First, I want to give you the best, to you, the graduates, the best piece of advice I have ever received in my life. And in saying that, I'm a little concerned, because I know that when my kids was your age, and my kids were your age, if I gave them advice, they didn't listen to it. So I'm not at all sure that this is going to have an impact on you, but at least I can be modestly hopeful. The second thing I want to do is I want to ask you for your help in something, but I'll come to that in a moment. To understand the best piece of advice I ever got in my life, you first have to ask yourself, what was it that you actually learned at university? I know the first thing you do when somebody asks you that is you tell them about all the facts and the data and the information that you needed to memorize or ingest in order to pass an exam. While this effort was obviously necessary, I would argue that this was not, in fact, the most valuable piece of your education. Indeed, the odds are that very rapidly you will forget a lot of those details. The most useful thing you actually learned in your time at Carleton is the way of attacking problems. That is what's going to stay with you long after you've forgotten all the other details. And it is that way of learning to think about problems, to think about situations you will confront in life, that is going to make it possible for you to achieve things that you might never, ever have thought you could do. And I say that because I want to tell you how I learned this piece of advice. When I was in my late 20s, I was a professor at Dalhousie, and I was offered the job as chief of staff to the newly elected Premier of Nova Scotia. And I asked many of my academic colleagues about whether or not I should take the job, and they almost universally counseled against it. After all, they said, it meant that I would be entering the dirty world of politics. I must admit I was surprised when political scientists told me that, but nevertheless, That's the advice I got. But a man much older and wiser urged me to take the job because he said this to me, and this is the piece of advice I got. It is not the things you do in life that you regret, it's the things you don't do. Go ahead, he said, take a risk. Don't be afraid to fail. Be willing to take on a challenge in an unfamiliar environment. Your university training has taught you how to think in such a way that you will be able to succeed. It was that one piece of advice which changed my life. It gave me the opportunity to go into government in October of 1970. And it was that same piece of advice that encouraged me to come back to Ottawa in early 1980 to take on the constitutional file for Pierre Trudeau. Even though, frankly, I knew nothing about the Constitution, I've always prided myself in not being a lawyer. Then I was asked to chair the task force on Atlantic fisheries, even though I didn't know anything about fisheries and hate fishing. After all, you can't talk on the phone when you're fishing, so there was no chance that I could ever be a fisherman. And then in the last decade or so that I was in the Senate, I took on the issue of mental health, of healthcare first and then mental health, even though I'm not trained in the health sciences in any way. And so in every case when I went to take these issues on, I referred back to the advice I've been given that said it's not the things in life that you do that you regret, it's the things that you don't do. And so I was very, very lucky. I had good timing, always important. It's what Lawrence called serendipity at the end of his speech. Superb people working with me. And most importantly, a way developed from my university training that I was able to attack problems. You now have the opportunity to do the same. And so I would urge you not to play it safe when it comes to the issue of changing jobs in the future. Being risk-averse, avoiding taking a chance will cause you to miss some of the great opportunities of your life. You face a future that is moving at warp speed compared to when I was young. Then the goal for many workers was a 40-year golden watch. You worked for 40 years and they always gave you a gold watch. Nobody's giving out gold watches anymore, and indeed I would suspect for every one of you, there's hardly a more sickening thought than the idea of working for the same employer for 40 years. So it doesn't take any great genius to predict that every one of you is going to have a series of different careers over the course of your life. And when you're concerned and thinking about changing a job, it will be particularly important that you do so when you find that you're nervous and apprehensive, because that nervous and apprehension, in fact, will generate for you a whole lot of adrenaline that, in fact, means the most important thing about any job. The most important thing about any job is not can you do it, it's do you emotionally care about it. If you emotionally care about something, if you are wrapped up in it, you will in fact be able to accomplish a great deal. And so as you move on to the next chapter in your life, when faced with a difficult decision about what to do or what not to do, I urge you to remember the advice that it's not the things you do in life that you will regret, it's the things you don't do. And so that naturally brings me to my second point, which is why I need your help. It is absolutely imperative that Canadians change their attitude towards individuals who have a mental illness. You know as well as I do the degree of stigma and discrimination that is attached to mental illness. And so the Mental Health Commission, which I was asked to put together, and I'm fortunate enough to chair the board, is going to be launching later on at the end of this year the first ever national social movement in support of mental health. We're going to call it Partners for Mental Health, but it will be for mental health what the Breast Cancer Association is, or heart and stroke, or diabetes. And what I need, and what everybody in this country who has mental illness needs is the leadership of your generation. Let me remind you, it was your generation that led the fight for fairness and equity for people infected with AIDS. It was your generation that led the fight in favor of gay marriage. Your generation is far more tolerant than some of the generations that came before, and your generation rejects unfairness whenever and wherever you see it. And so everyone in Canada, and there are several million of them, everyone in Canada who is suffering from a mental illness needs your help. And remember, when you do that, if you do join up when the organization becomes launched this fall, remember that you're not just helping adults or so-called older people. Let me just tell you two interesting facts about mental illness among your generation. The biggest single killer of Canadians between the ages of 15 and 25 is not automobile accidents, it's suicide. That's a very striking number which most people don't know, and yet even more staggering is the fact that Canada has the third highest incidence of youth suicide in the industrialized world. And I say to you that that is simply and utterly intolerable, and something has to be done about it. The other thing is, if I asked every one of you, I'm sure every one of you knows someone of roughly your own age who has some kind of mental problem. Maybe it's anxiety disorder, depression, whatever. Because the fact is that 70% of adults with a mental illness had the onset of that illness when they were under the age of 24. And yet, regrettably, a great many of those people never get help. And they never get help because 38%, that's 2 in 5 of Canadian parents, would not seek help if they thought a child had a mental illness problem because of the stigma and discrimination that the parents feel would be attached to the child and attached to themselves. So we have a great deal to do, but we need your help. And from your point of view, by the way, this is going to be fun. This is the first time anybody's attempted to launch a social movement in Canada as strictly a virtual movement. The entire thing will be done using the media of communications, using the social networking sites, using the things that all of you use in your everyday basis. And so I would ask you in closing that when Partners for Mental Health gets launched, you make it the first illustration of following the advice I gave you, that you decide to join so that later in life you do not regret not having been in at the start of what will be truly a great Canadian revolution. Congratulations again, and thank you.